Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lorenzo and Sangallo. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, we're back at it with our sixth and final episode treating the court of Lorenzo the Magnificent. We've looked at a lot of his history, not only in this small series on his court, but in many instances throughout the whole podcast. There genuinely is so much to say, not only because an unlimited number of texts have been written about Lorenzo, but because he was genuinely surrounded by and enabled such a massive amount of unimaginable talent. So yes, we've gone through some of his family, his writers, painters, philosophers. Now we close this chapter on a topic that Lorenzo was considered an expert on in his own lifetime, architecture. Still, busy statesman that he did not function as his own court architect, but rather had an extremely close relationship with a man known as Giuliano Giamberti, or better known as Giuliano da Sangallo. I will refer to this architect as Sangallo, but that's only because we have been so inundated by Giulianos, I think it's fair to avoid any confusion. However, I'm sure that you have heard me rail against the use of these nicknames as first names. It would be like calling Rafael da Urbino from Urbino, which would be strange as opposed to Raphael. So, same with Leonardo da Vinci. We don't call him da Vinci, we call him Leonardo. You get the picture. We're going to call him Sangallo. Sangallo was born in Florence, not a place called Sangallo, though. So, as we'll see, this name does not come from his origin, but rather the church of Sangallo that he designed and built under the commission of his friend and patron Lorenzo the Magnificent. So, Sangallo, in this sense, refers to his architectural work, not where he's from, which is slightly unusual, but it helps us avoid any more Giuliano confusion. He was born around 1445 in Florence into a family with a history of craftsmanship. His father, Francesco Giamberti, was a skilled woodworker, a furniture maker, and he worked for the Medici family under Lorenzo's grandfather, that would be Cosimo de' Medici, an early connection that would prove significant for Sangallo. We saw this with Poliziano too, whose father had ties to Lorenzo's father, Piero de' Medici. Growing up in such a family environment, Sangallo was exposed from a young age to both the technical aspects of building and the artistic atmosphere of Renaissance Florence. He likely received a traditional workshop training, learning drawing, carving, architectural drafting alongside his brothers, actually, including another well known architect, Antonio da Sangallo the Elder. We call him the Elder because Antonio da Sangallo the Younger is Giuliano da Sangallo's son. Giuliano's early training, Giuliano da Sangallo, blended manual skill with intellectual curiosity, influenced by the revival of classical knowledge that defines this moment of Renaissance history. As you all know, Florence in the mid-15th century was a hub of innovation, and Sangallo absorbed the ideas circulating among artists, humanists, and, of course, architects. He almost certainly had studied ancient Roman ruins and probably Vitruvian principles. You remember Vitruvius? He was an ancient Roman author who wrote architectural theory. The most important text for the Renaissance architect was Vitruvius's De Architectura. In fact, the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo is a representation of that. And that lays the foundation for Sangallo's later classical style of architecture. We're going to look at that. The records of his formal education are actually scarce. Sangallo's early life clearly combined hands-on apprenticeship with exposure to high art and design. This blend of practical and theoretical training would become a hallmark of his architectural identity in the works that we're about to discuss. I think when we look at the sum of his life and work, Giuliano da Sangallo has probably been overlooked in the canon. That's just my experience. He is certainly the heir to Filippo Brunelleschi and Battista Alberti. In my own experience, I have never been formally educated on his works, which seems like an error to me when you look at the trajectory of Renaissance art education. I pursued him on my own. Traditionally, you learn all about Brunelleschi and Alberti. Sometimes you get an interlude from Michelozzo, that was Cosimo's court architect who designed the Medici Palace, as well as Cosimo's library and renovations in the convent of San Marco in Florence. Then Renaissance art history typically jumps to Bramante and Michelangelo and what was going on in Rome in the early 1500s, which Sangallo was there. Not only was Sangallo an active architect, but he was a bridge, let's say, between the early Renaissance of Alberti and Brunelleschi and the high Renaissance of Bramante and Michelangelo. He was highly active in courts beyond Lorenzo's and trained his own children as architects, who would serve as as architects for the princes of Renaissance Rome. This is to say nothing of the importance of Giuliano da Sangallo's own works for Lorenzo. If we remember that starting around 1480 was the beginning of a major patronage by Lorenzo, that is also when he decided to commission his own villa at Poggio a Caiano, a small town on the outskirts of Florence. This was going to be Lorenzo's place of rest, repose, and peace, a country villa that would serve as a completely new form and prototype of the Renaissance villa, one that embodied all of the ideals of the Florentine humanism and Neoplatonic thought that was being cultivated in Lorenzo's court. Of course, while Lorenzo would have had a heavy hand in curating this plan, the architectural plan, and the function and the philosophical rendering of his paradise on earth, it was his friend and architect Giuliano da Sangallo to whom he appointed the commission. And of course, there was a practical side of this villa as well. Lorenzo was not only building his country villa on the edge of the Mugello, that is the place in Tuscany where the Medici family came from, and therefore he was maintaining Medici presence there, near there. Not just presence, but power and prestige beyond just the city of Florence. But by building a villa there, he was also serving as oversight to an architectural development plan and investments for the Medici family business. Certainly, agriculture was not the main source of Medici profit by a long shot, but it did serve as a means of making some money back on the building of luxurious country villas, as well as associating Medici power with the supply of food, which was critical in maintaining not only public favor, but dispelling the threat of famine that was taken very seriously during the Renaissance period. Beyond these practical effects of building a country villa, it cannot be set aside that Lorenzo was one who delighted in the countryside, the very Tuscan countryside we all today love and enjoy. In any of his country villas, Lorenzo could get away from the city, pressures of being a statesman, where all eyes are on him, and engage in his favorite activities: poetry, philosophy, gardening, and even hunting. Before building could even begin on the villa, once the location was selected, it had to be flattened because it's put on a hill, and then they had to engineer the diversion of a nearby river known as the Ombrone, is the river that runs through this part of Tuscany. And they also had to build a wall as both a means of like defense and seclusion. Work on the villa itself seems to have begun in 1485. We know that parts of the villa were inhabited before Lorenzo's death in 1492 because he was known to stay at Poggio a Caiano and find respite there in several occasions before his death. Still, the villa was left unfinished with the Medici expulsion of 1494 and resumed under Pope Leo X. Remember, that's Lorenzo the Magnificent's son, elected pope, who was still working with Giuliano da Sangallo on the villa until 1516 when Giuliano da Sangallo died. So let's look at this thing as it is today. And again, this is the Medici Villa Poggio a Caiano, commissioned by Lorenzo and designed by Giuliano da Sangallo. It represents one of the earliest examples of the application of classical principles to a domestic country residence, not architecture in general, but in this arena. That means a symmetrical plan, use of balanced proportions, and classical vocabulary, which reflects Sangallo's deep engagement with ancient Roman architecture, again, likely inspired by Vitruvian ideals, the same ones that inspired Brunelleschi and Alberti. The villa's most striking feature is the temple front portico with 6 Ionic columns supporting a pediment. A pediment that is a triangular piece and explicit reference to ancient Greek and Roman temple facades. It's that big triangular top to a temple facade. This element, elevated above a broad central staircase, gives the villa a sense of grandeur while emphasizing balance and clarity, right? The integration of a loggia, brick, and stucco, it's fostering an openness and a visual connection with the surrounding Tuscan landscape, embodying, remember, that humanist notion of harmony between man and nature. Unlike medieval fortified villas or even the Renaissance villas, especially the Medici Villa designed by Michelozzo for Cosimo, Poggio a Caiano was designed as a place of leisure and intellectual retreat. Yes, it had walls, but they were not integral to the main villa design. The elevated platform, refined stucco decoration, and axial symmetry introduced this is the important part, a new typology for elite country residences. This is the new standard. This is the new prototype, and it is born here. Sangallo's design not only fulfilled Lorenzo's desire for the classical elegance in the architecture, but also influenced villa architecture throughout the Italian Renaissance and beyond.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
Ultimately, we have a balanced, rectangular villa that appears to be placed upon a wide, elevated portico. Sangallo also shows his ability to smoothly integrate both Greek and Roman architectural principles into a single building, but get this, while showing that he knows the difference between the two. On the ground, he is consistent with Roman architectural motifs, that is, rounded arches and barrel vaults with Roman decorative elements. But the temple facade above the grand staircase is the facade of an Ionic Greek temple with a bit of a Renaissance twist. Do we know our classical orders, guys? Doric, like the Parthenon in Athens, Ionic, and then Corinthian. These would have all been known to Sangallo from his studies of Vitruvius. At the villa, what you get is Ionic columns with a continuous frieze, then a pediment. This is standard Ionic. A frieze, by the way, not what happens to your brain when you eat too much gelato. It is this sculpture that spans horizontally across the lintel, which is supported by the columns. In this case, this is the Renaissance part. It's glazed terracotta in brilliant, gorgeous white, blue, and green. This is called maiolica. Maiolica is not just like frieze. It's glazed ceramic decoration, Luca della Robbia type stuff. You can call certain vases and plates and in lusterwares maiolica. It's the style. And it's a name that was probably inherited from the style of Mallorca in Spain, which developed its style because they were for a very long time under the control of the Arabs, who imported highly sophisticated lusterware techniques. In Italy, it's known as maiolica. So we have a maiolica frieze, which was certainly part of the original decoration and commission by Lorenzo. Remember, it gets finished later by Pope Leo X after his death. This maiolica frieze was part of the original design, and it was probably seen and completed during Lorenzo's lifetime. As of now, there are a few theories as to who designed it. It could have been Sangallo himself, but Bertoldo di Giovanni, remember that sculptor who first trained Michelangelo in Lorenzo's garden? He's a contender, and it's also attributed to a sculptor and architect by the name of Andrea Sansovino, who has no relation whatsoever to that magnificent architect Jacopo Sansovino, who will help redesign Venice during the Renaissance. No relation. So we don't know. Was it Sangallo? Was it Bertoldo di Giovanni? Was it Andrea Sansovino? In any case, it's gorgeous. And then above the Maiolica frieze is the pediment. And the pediment of this make-believe temple bears the coat of arms of the Medici family, effectively reappropriating the architectural elements of ancient Greek religious buildings into that of a private space of a wealthy Renaissance prince. And while, yes, this is an Ionic Greek temple, it could also sort of look like the Pantheon in Rome, which was Roman. But I am of the mind that this is certainly a reference specifically to Greek architecture. And although this form is entirely novel, and Lorenzo worked on it with Sangallo as opposed to Sangallo having designed it all on his own, we see the lingering inspiration of the Renaissance architecture through Brunelleschi, who designed the dome, the cupolone. The space is balanced. Pietra serena is used, that gray Tuscan stone that was believed to help add color harmony to space. That, coupled with the plain stucco on the facade, rather than busy decoration, we see a clear expression of classical orders, and it's clearly inspired likewise by the Florentine masters who Sangallo diligently studied, Brunelleschi and Alberti. Through the end of his lifetime, Lorenzo did continue to give time and attention to finishing the villa decoration. At some point, he hired Filippino Lippi, the famous son of the famous friar Filippo Lippi. So Filippino frescoed parts of the villa, which today actually, unfortunately, remain in very poor condition. In the end, there are delights in painting, sculpture, and architecture to be found in Poggio a Caiano, a building that had undoubted echoes in the future of Renaissance villa architecture. So let's step away from the villa at Poggio a Caiano, where we see these ideals at their peak in a work that Lorenzo and Sangallo worked on in Prato, which was by this time under Florentine control, which means indirectly under Medicean control. I am talking about the Church of Santa Maria delle Carceri, which is a splendid, centrally planned building and actually is located along my regular walk to go get groceries. So I see this building pretty much 3 or 4 times a week. It's a church here in Prato, which is a city still belonging to locals, at least here in the historic center. And at night, it becomes an extension of a classy aperitivo bar where locals sit along the wide bench that goes around the church and they have their drinks and they bring in the evening and kids run in the piazza and play soccer and people laugh and enjoy each other's company, all underneath the beautiful and monumental design of Giuliano da Sangallo. It's a living space. So what's the story? This was built on the site of a former prison. That's where the name comes from. Saint Mary of the Prisons or the Prisoners, Santa Maria delle Carceri, where in 1484, while it was still a prison, it was reported that an image of the Virgin Mary inside the prison had come to life before the eyes of a spectator. The result of this miraculous event was that the city of Prato wanted to replace this chapel in the prison with a new church to enshrine the miraculous image. As the story goes, the citizens of Prato held an open competition for the design of the new church, which is standard in the Renaissance. You hold an architecture design. But they could not pick a design. And when they could not come to a conclusion for this architectural competition, Lorenzo was asked to intervene and to appoint an architect, in which he chose none other than his good friend and his prized architect who was working on his villa, Giuliano da Sangallo. So now we have a church that needs to be built to enshrine a miraculous image of the Virgin Mary. The result was the rare deployment of a centrally planned church and a cross plan with a dome. Sangallo referenced none other than Brunelleschi for the design, relying heavily on pietra serena, that gray stone, and white stucco for the interior decoration, as well as directly mimicking the structures and designs of the domes in both Brunelleschi's sacristy in San Lorenzo in Florence and the Pazzi Chapel in Santa Croce. Two domes that Sangallo is looking at to make this new one in Prato, both from Brunelleschi. Like he was designing at Poggio a Caiano, there is a gorgeous glazed terracotta band, that's maiolica, which breaks up the interior composition. And the magnificent Domenico Ghirlandaio did some designs for the stained glass windows as well, which are still there in the church. The exterior, although, like everything that happens in the Renaissance, was left unfinished, is a direct reference to the works of Leon Battista Alberti. That is, white marble offset by a stone that is called green serpentine or serpentina. That is a dark green stone that is quarried in Prato that we also see used in the Florence Baptistry and in Alberti's facade of Santa Maria Novella. The major difference is that Santa Maria Novella has a single facade that looks somewhat like a Greek temple, whereas Sangallo had at least 3 full sides to work with, each of which he outfitted with Greek orders. The lower part replicates Doric elements, where the top is of Ionic design with a pediment on each side. It's a classical temple, not a country villa, but slapped onto several sides of a centrally planned cross church in the middle of a booming city within Florence's domain. The effect, both inside and out, is emblematic of the way in which classicizing harmonized architecture centered on Brunelleschian and Albertian ideals became a joint style under the careful design of Giuliano da Sangallo. To make it even more stunning, it is built right next to the 13th century castle of the Emperor Frederick II, which still stands in all of its glory. Beyond these two monumental works, the villa at Poggio a Caiano, Santa Maria delle Carceri in Prato, Sangallo also designed Palazzo Gondi in Florence for the Gondi family, which is steps away from the Bargello Museum, if you know the Bargello, and looks closely to Michelozzo's work on the Palazzo Medici. He also submitted a model for the very famous Palazzo Strozzi in Florence, and just like Poggio a Caiano and Santa Maria delle Carceri, he also designed the Church of San Gallo in the 1480s. He was a busy man in the 1480s, and this was also commissioned by Lorenzo to be built for a monastery outside of the city walls, the Porta San Gallo. Here's the sad part. The Church of San Gallo, the one that gave him his name, Giuliano da Sangallo, was destroyed in 1529 during the siege of Florence. This is a bit of irony because it was led by Pope Clement VII, that is, Giuliano de' Medici's son, Giulio, who commanded an army to reinstate Medici power in Florence, subsequently creating the first Medici Duke, Alessandro de' Medici, whose legitimacy was traced to him as being the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, thus justifying the first Medici rulers of Florence with the official title of Duke, backed by the Medici Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. That was the siege that destroyed this magnificent work of architecture by Giuliano da Sangallo, commissioned by the Lorenzo the Magnificent, in which the new duke was getting his legitimacy from. But a little more on Giuliano da Sangallo. He was called to Rome in the early 1500s to work on designs for the new St. Peter's Basilica. That was under Pope Julius II. But control of the basilica planning was ultimately given to Bramante. Vasari tells us that while Sangallo was in Rome, he consulted with Michelangelo to help solve a mold issue that was manifesting inside the Sistine Chapel while it was being painted. This man, Giuliano da Sangallo, and his work is not of little consequence, nor was Lorenzo's use of him in his patronage of architecture. Renaissance people, I could go on, but really this concludes our direct conversations about Lorenzo the Magnificent, about his court, his artists, his revolutionary impact, his architects. I'm happy that in this process we were able to shine light on many of the greats, from Botticelli to the Pollaiolo, from Lucrezia Tornabuoni to Angelo Poliziano, and now to Giuliano da Sangallo. And there are many more that we just cannot cover. We move to another court next, and although probably in less detail, I think it will be exciting. I hope you enjoyed these 6 episodes on Lorenzo the Magnificent. Until next time, arrivederci.